I'm going to do a walkthrough of a post we put up a while back showing a chart from evidence-based literacy instruction called Practices to Accelerate Student Reading. I've posted the full chart in our feed for your reference. This post generated a decent number of questions because, let's be honest, we all want to accelerate our kids' reading proficiency, and there's a bit of jargon in this chart. So I'm going to break this down over a few reels going 3 squares at a time from top to bottom. Number 1, teach the sound first instead of teaching the letter name first. So this principle stems from what the science of reading has revealed about how the reading brain works. Meaning the phonological processing centers, housed in the left hemisphere of the brain, are the most efficient home base for reading. So when we focus on a letter's sound as its primary meaning instead of its name, we're tapping right into a student's phonological processing skills, helping children prioritize the letter-sound connection which builds directly into decoding, also known as reading. Think of it this way, when we read words, we don't rehearse letter names in our heads. T-H-E-C-A-T-S-A-T-O-N-T-H-E-B-E-D. Ugh. No, as we read a sentence, we hear it in our heads like spoken language, which uses sounds. The cat sat on the bed. In case you were wondering what the heck that sentence was. 2. Look at the text, not the pictures, to read words. This one's pretty obvious. Basically, a student's eyes should always be directed to the words on the page. Pictures are not there to give clues to the reader, as many erroneously believe. Rather, they're there to provide some visual entertainment and to help young readers envision what they've read. But when the pictures disappear, as they tend to do across increasingly complex literature, what reading skills are you left with? If using picture clues was a big part of your reading strategy, you've got trouble, my friends. Right here in River City. 3. Read all the sounds in the word, left to right. Do not just read the first sound. This one gets to the heart of what good reading involves, which is always processing all the sounds in a word. Did I stutter? Ooh, can a speech therapist say that? All joking aside, yes, research has shown that good readers always process all the sounds in a word, always, always. Over time, as you read a word many, many times, a process called fast mapping occurs, which essentially allows any word that you've sounded out multiple times to become a sight word. Voila, you don't have to sound this word out every time you see it anymore. But here's the kicker. fMRI studies have revealed that strong readers are still processing all the sounds in sight words as they read them. This basically means that we've had the idea behind sight word reading wrong for decades, but more on that later. Okay, so continuing our breakdown with principle number 4. Sound out unfamiliar words. Don't guess or memorize. Memorizing or guessing is basically a big no-no when it comes to reading any word, not just unfamiliar ones. Remember the fast mapping I mentioned in part 1? Well, that's the process that essentially happens for all familiar words. This is how we're able to become fluent readers. But a common misconception is that all words we can read quickly are words we've memorized. Nuh-uh. They've just been fast mapped, which means we recognize them instantaneously after a multitude of sounding out experiences. When students get in the habit of memorizing words, they tend to do so by looking at the word like a whole picture and memorizing its visual features. And decades of research has shown this to be insanely inefficient. There are too many words in English and our memories do not have the capacity for this. Also, it leads to a lot of guessing on unfamiliar words and even familiar ones because students have never developed strong word attack skills. This being tracking across sounds and syllables to decode a word. Have you ever tried to read the pharmaceutical name for a medication on a prescription bottle? Methylene diazepam. That's about as unfamiliar as it gets, but if my only reading strategy was to regurgitate words I've memorized, I'd have no hope in this situation. And if you're going to troll this video saying, we rarely have to read words like that, so how important are sound and syllable tracking skills really? First of all, love the hat. Second of all, Trey important. Trey. Just pull out any science or history article or any piece of literature over a 5th grade reading level. Photosynthesis, Bronchiosaurus, constituency, imperialism, enthusiasm, incomprehensible. Do you want your child to be able to read these words? They aren't that obscure. Number 5, students should track under the words smoothly with their finger rather than tapping. I believe this one is referring to helping students explicitly practice blending. Blending is when a student can slide all the sounds in a word together smoothly so it sounds like one coherent word instead of a bunch of individual sounds. When we read one sound at a time, it's called segmenting, and it doesn't sound very natural or fluent. But segmenting sounds in a word is how we first direct students to decode new words. However, we must also quickly get to blending practice, helping them transition to smoothly tracking across all sounds in the word without pausing. Now, does this mean we jump from sounding out to memorizing a whole word? No. Hear me. No. That's not it. Learning to blend is still sound processing, just more fluently and automatically. And this step often needs more explicit practice than people think, particularly for struggling learners. 6. Teach tendencies or patterns instead of rules. The idea behind this one is that English is highly pattern-based, but doesn't have a lot of hard and fast rules. This is why you hear a lot of teachers saying things like, "That's a rule breaker," or "That word doesn't follow the rule." Well, if we would stop calling everything a rule when it's only true like 80% of the time, then we wouldn't have all these delinquent words. Basically, a rule that's only true like 3 out of 4 times isn't a rule. It's a pattern. English is full of patterns, not rules, and the good news is our brains are generally really good at picking up on patterns. The reasons English doesn't have a lot of hard and fast rules is threefold. 1, English is really old. 2, it doesn't derive from just one source language. It's like the dumping ground from all other languages. I can't remember who originally said that English is like a thug that hangs out in the alleyway and beats up all the other languages to rifle through their pockets for loose vocabulary. And 3, the written system of English, also known as orthography or spelling, was layered on top of an already established spoken language, thus making it a prime candidate for inconsistencies. And oh boy, did we deliver. I'll let you digest that for now. More breakdown of row 3 of the chart coming up in my next reel. Today we're breaking down row 3 of the chart and starting with principle number 7. Interleave instruction as opposed to teaching to mastery. Raise your hand if you're annoyed at the word choice of interleave on a chart about teaching kids how to read. Interleave means to mix or alternate between. This principle gets at the idea that teaching each skill to full mastery before moving on isn't super time efficient, particularly for struggling learners. It also assumes that learning to read is completely linear and sequential and every skill exists in isolation. They don't. Rather, literacy is a coordination of many skills that need to operate together. A synthesis, if you will. Teaching to 100% mastery is problematic for practice and application, which is a key part of good literacy instruction. I personally like to get a skill to about 80% mastery before moving on. And I honestly really only require that a skill be explicitly taught before I begin to work on applying it in context. The context is reading and spelling. The elusive mastery that we hope to achieve actually happens best in the continuous and consistent applied practice to reading and writing. The takeaway? For every discrete skill that you explicitly teach, work on mastery alongside other previously taught skills in reading, in spelling, in original writing. This is how you achieve the consolidation and synthesis of literacy skills. Number 8. Scaffold writing instruction and correct misspelled words in writing. Now here's some jargon. What does it mean to scaffold? Scaffolding refers to explicitly teaching in distinct segments, providing less and less support as students gain mastery. Kind of like, what's it called? Scaffolding. It's also often referred to as the I do it, we do it, you do it model. Or as we like to say, I do it, we 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 do it. You do it. Because the supported practice is where all the learning happens. Okay, terminology aside, this principle is about writing. Writing. The big missing piece to literacy instruction nationwide. Well, there's a lot of missing pieces. I could and maybe should make a whole separate reel about writing instruction, but basically, writing is not just a spontaneous byproduct of reading, meaning kids don't just learn to write by having learned to read. Reading and writing must be explicitly taught together, and writing needs a lot of practice, and spelling needs a lot of practice. In writing, spelling tends to not actually reach a level of automaticity unless practiced in writing. Okay, I hear it. Automaticity is a word, I swear. But look, this is why there are words you can read but not spell. Or your kid can spell these words correctly on the quiz but never spells them correctly when writing a sentence or a paragraph. Well, were these words ever practiced in writing? Of all the language domains, speaking, listening, reading, and writing is far and away the most complex. Okay, speaking is also complex. But given its mondo complexity, I'm not sure how writing became such an afterthought in education. Truly, the mind boggles. Number 9, teach the correct way to form letters and correct errors in handwriting. This one is a similar concept to the last, but focusing on handwriting. It's distinct from writing. Handwriting is the physical formation and fluency of letters via hand using a writing utensil. Writing is the ability to compose original, coherent thoughts and translate them to paper, using written grammatical conventions and mechanics. Letter formation is originally taught in isolation and is then consolidated alongside other literacy skills in contextualized handwriting practice for automaticity and fluency. And why do we care about skills becoming fluent and automatic anyway? Because when a skill becomes automatic, it becomes way less cognitively taxing. And the more skills we can consolidate down to a level of automaticity, the greater complexity of reading and writing tasks we can take on. Kind of like if I had consolidated the information in this video down to fewer minutes, the less your brain would be overloaded right now. Alright, I'll see you next time for part 4. Hey, it's Moira from Rooted in Language, here to finally bring you part 4 of the practices to accelerate reading breakdown. We can do it, just hang in there. Number 10. Teach the code as well as blending and segmenting within the context of words, not in isolation. I think I sufficiently covered segmenting and blending in part 2, so if you haven't watched, move on back. But the idea behind this principle is basically to practice word reading skills in applied text. Phrases, sentences, passages, whole books. Learn to read word, practice reading word in context. Learn a swimming stroke, practice swimming stroke in the water. If you only ever practice decoding skills in isolated words, kids can get stuck in that stilted, segmenting, sounded out phase. Lots of word reading in applied context, however, helps get that number of exposures needed for fast mapping to occur, which is key for achieving reading fluency. Reading a word over and over in context until I no longer have to sound it out every time. Swimming laps over and over until I no longer have to think about all the individual movements of the stroke. It's automatic. Okay, I think you get the metaphor. Also, if kids aren't practicing reading words in context, they struggle to consolidate their decoding skills with their comprehension skills. And what is reading if we're not comprehending what we read? Remember, reading is comprised of 3 overarching skills: accuracy, fluency, and comprehension. You can only practice meshing all 3 in context using literature. And this literature I'm talking about doesn't have to be Huckleberry Finn. It can and initially should be decodable, controlled readers. Side note, because I know you're going to ask, controlled text is text that only includes phonics and spelling patterns that have been explicitly taught to the student. Look for literacy programs that provide this. Psst, we do in our Pinwheels program. Number 11 is a biggie. Teach speech to print. This phrase is thrown around a lot in the literacy world, but what does it mean? Speech to print refers to closely coordinating word-level reading and spelling instruction with what we already know in our spoken language systems. It begins with phonemic awareness skills, identifying each speech sound that we hear in a word and then mapping those sounds onto the spelling of that word. The focus here is on sound and on language. Okay, so before kids learn how to read, they already have these whole linguistic systems in place. Speaking skills, listening skills, also known as expressive and receptive language. And yet, somehow, many literacy programs and teachers seem to completely bypass the connection between spoken language and written language. A big mistake, my friends. The verbal skills kids already bring to the table when learning to read are powerful assets to becoming literate. And despite all the sight word pushers and the just memorize the weird words mumbo jumbo that's still so prevalent out there, the reality is that all words have sounds. And those sounds always correspond with certain letters in a word's written form. I am not saying every letter has a one-to-one correspondence with a sound in every word, but every word is made up of sounds, and those sounds are represented in the spelling in some way. Am I confusing you? Because I'm confusing myself. More on this in my next reel, all about sight words. But here's the thing about speech to print. Chances are, before a kid can read a word, they can probably say that word. They also may, and likely do, have some grammatical knowledge of a lot of words. This knowledge comes from just using these words in their spoken language all the time, and that can really aid their spelling. Let's make this visible. Take the word jumped, for example. Now, our phonological systems, or our sound processing skills, can connect the sounds that we hear in this word to the letters that we see in this word, which actually gets us pretty far in terms of reading and spelling it. Wait a minute, we say and hear a T at the end of that word. So that's as far as speech gets us, but then our language skills pop in, and they're like, oh yeah, jumped is how I say jump in the past, when it already happened. Past tense usually means ed, so that t sound I hear is actually an ed suffix. Oh, bam! My verbal language skills, both speech and language, just enabled me to spell that word. And before you say, be practical, brand new readers don't know anything about past tense. Of course they do. Are you telling me kids don't talk about the games they played yesterday? Or what they dreamed about last night? Or how they felt at breakfast when you dared to give them the blue cup instead of the green one? Kids have been using complex grammatical forms for years before they learn anything about how they're represented in print. And with just a modicum of explicit teaching, you see this ed? That's called a suffix. We put the ed suffix at the end of base words to show they happened in the past. We help kids utilize and connect this arsenal of knowledge that they already have in their verbal language systems to literacy. And finally, number 12. Read out loud to students using a novel that is above the ability level of your highest reader. This last principle is about listening comprehension, which is usually at a higher level than a student's independent reading level. Their independent reading level is what they can read accurately and comprehend adequately when reading on their own. Not listening on their own, reading on their own. Why am I always wagging my finger at you guys? Swish and flick! Anyway, my point is listening comprehension skills are distinct from reading comprehension skills. We can push, challenge, and grow listening comprehension skills by listening to literature that is above the student's independent reading level. This helps grow vocabulary and gives exposure to complex syntactical structures. Parents of multiple children do this naturally all the time. Pick a book that challenges the oldest intellectually while the younger ones still glean what they can and benefit. Just be careful not to assume your child's listening comprehension level is the same as their independent reading comprehension level. For struggling readers, it usually isn't. In fact, this is one of the main reasons struggling readers often prefer to listen to audiobooks. Their listening comprehension skills well exceed their independent reading comprehension skills, because independent reading also requires strong accuracy and fluency skills. Okay. That's a wrap, folks. I hope you found this series helpful and informative to your literacy instruction. And please like, comment, and share to spread these important messages. Every child has the right to literacy, but many are being denied that right due to poor, uninformed, and often detrimental literacy instruction. I don't think I'm overstating it when I say reading changes lives. Be a life changer. As always, for more expert guidance on teaching language arts and literacy, keep watching. We've got you covered.